She sold her house, every single brick of it. The porch, where her grandmother used to rock in the evenings with a glass of sweet tea. The kitchen where she burned her first Thanksgiving turkey and laughed until her sides hurt. The bedroom where she cried herself to sleep for 3 months, straight after the divorce. Margaret Elaine Whitmore, 42 years old, signed the papers on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the colour of a bruise. Walked out with a cheque for $187,000 and drove 300 miles south to a dying auction barn on the edge of Mercer County, Kentucky. She did not tell her mother. She did not tell her sister. She did not tell the 2 friends who still answered her texts. She simply vanished from one life and appeared in another, holding a bidding paddle and a heart so broken it no longer knew how to feel fear. The auctioneer was a man named Cull, who chewed tobacco and spoke in a rhythm that sounded like rain on a tin roof. Lot number 47 came up around noon, when the sun was pressing against the metal roof and the air inside smelled like diesel and desperation. 37 sheep stood in the pen, and they were the saddest creatures Margaret had ever seen. Their ribs showed, through matted fleeces, the colour of old dishwater. Their eyes were dull. Their hooves were cracked. Some had patches where the wool had fallen out entirely, revealing pink skin marked with scars and insect bites. A handwritten sign on the gate said cull ewes, meat only. The starting bid was $12 a head. People laughed. Not the cruel laugh of children on a playground, but the tired laugh of farmers who had seen too much death and too little profit. One old man in overalls spat on the concrete and said, "Whoever buys those bags of bones deserves what they get." Another woman, her face leathered by decades of sun, shook her head and muttered that it would be kinder to shoot them right there in the pen. A younger man in a faded cap took a video on his phone, probably planning to post it later with some mocking caption about the state of modern agriculture. The smell of manure and hay, mixed with the metallic scent of machinery, creating an atmosphere that felt like the end of something rather than the beginning. Margaret raised her paddle. The auctioneer looked at her like she had just confessed to a crime. $12, he called out. "Do I hear 15? Silence. The paddles stayed down. The crowd turned. 42 pairs of eyes settled on this stranger in city clothes. This woman with manicured nails and a silver necklace who had no business being at a livestock auction in the middle of harvest season. 15? The auctioneer tried again, his voice losing its music. Nothing. Going once. Going twice. Sold to the lady in the blue jacket for $12 a head. $444 for 37 souls that the world had already given up on. Margaret walked to the pen, and the sheep shuffled away from her, expecting pain. She reached through the bars and touched the nose of the smallest one. A ewe with one ear torn and eyes the colour of amber honey. "I see you," she whispered. "I see you, and I am not leaving." 3 days later, the laughter started. It came from the neighbouring farms first, carried on the wind across the 47 acres of overgrown pasture Margaret had purchased with the remaining money from her house. The property was a joke itself, a place where nothing had grown except thistles and regret for 15 years. The barn had a roof that sagged like a tired horse's back. The fencing was held together by rusted wire and prayers. The well water ran brown for the first week. But Margaret did not care about any of that. She cared about the 37 sheep in the south paddock, the ones she was feeding by hand, because they were too weak to compete for hay. She cared about the way they flinched when she approached, the way they huddled together at night like children afraid of the dark. She named them all. Not cute names like Fluffy or Snowball, but serious names that carried weight. Ruth, Esther, Miriam, Delilah, Thelma. Each name a promise that this creature would matter. The neighbours came by on the fourth day, pretending to welcome her to the community, but really coming to see the spectacle. Jed Carver, who farmed 300 acres of soybeans to the east, leaned on his truck and watched Margaret carry 5-gallon buckets of water across the field. His son, a boy of maybe 16 with acne and arrogance, took pictures on his phone. Jed did not laugh out loud, but his smile said everything. That night, Margaret heard the story at the feed store in town, where she had gone to buy mineral blocks and dewormer. A group of men in John Deere hats were talking about the crazy woman from Cincinnati who bought a dead farm and a bunch of walking skeletons. One of them said she would be broke by Christmas. Another said he would give it 6 weeks before she called the renderer to haul the carcasses away. Margaret stood in the aisle with a 50-pound bag of sheep pellets in her arms, and she felt the heat rise in her chest. She set the bag down, walked over to the group and said, "My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I would appreciate it if you spoke about me and my animals with the same respect you would want for your own family." Then she paid for her supplies, loaded them into her second-hand truck, and drove home without looking back. But the laughter did not stop. It grew. It spread through the county like a virus, infecting every diner and church basement and grain elevator. The story was too good to resist. A divorced city woman with no farming experience, no family in agriculture, no backup plan, had sunk her entire net worth into the worst piece of land in the county and the most pathetic flock of sheep anyone had ever seen. The local newspaper ran a small piece on page 7, more as a human interest curiosity than a real story. The headline called her the Sheep Lady of Mercer County, and the article quoted Jed Carver, saying that some people have more money than sense. Margaret's mother called from Ohio, her voice tight with worry and judgment. "Margaret, what are you doing? You had a beautiful house. You had security. You had a life." Margaret looked out the window at Ruth and Esther, who were now strong enough to graze without trembling. And she said, "Mom, I am building a life. I am just using different materials." The stakes were higher than anyone knew. Margaret had not just sold her house. She had sold a safety tee. She had sold the last symbol of the marriage that had defined her entire adult life. She had sold the place where she had planned to grow old, to host grandchildren, to die peacefully in her sleep surrounded by photographs and memories. She had traded all of that for 47 acres of weeds, a barn that leaked when it rained, and 37 sheep that the agricultural establishment had written off as worthless. The first tragedy layer was the divorce itself, the 18-month nightmare that had stripped her of her identity, her confidence, and her belief that she was worthy of love. Her husband had not just left her for a younger woman. He had left her with a mountain of debt, a reputation in shambles, and a heart so guarded that she no longer knew how to receive kindness without suspicion. He had taken the friends, the social standing, the future she had carefully constructed, like a house of cards. When the divorce was finalized, Margaret had looked around her beautiful home and realized it was just a building filled with objects that no longer meant anything. The photographs on the walls were of a stranger wearing her face. The furniture had been chosen by a woman who no longer existed. The garden she had tended for 12 years felt like it belonged to someone else's memory. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The second tragedy layer was the medical diagnosis she had received 3 weeks before the auction. the one she had told no one about. The mammogram that showed a shadow. The biopsy that confirmed what the doctors would only call a concerning mass. The surgery scheduled for November that she could no longer afford because she had no health insurance and no house to borrow against. Margaret carried this secret like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold, every morning when she woke before dawn to check on the sheep. Every night when she fell into her sleeping bag in the corner of the barn. Because the farmhouse was still uninhabitable, she felt the weight of that stone. She was not just fighting for the sheep. She was fighting for proof that she could survive something, that she could face the darkness and not blink. The doctor had been kind but clear. Without treatment, the survival statistics were not in her favour. With treatment, there was hope, but hope required money she no longer had. So she made a choice that seemed insane to everyone else, but made perfect sense to her. She would invest her remaining time and money into something that mattered. If she was going to die, she would die having loved something deeply. If she was going to live, she would live having proven that she could create beauty from absolute ruin. She would rather be remembered as the woman who tried and failed than as the woman who never tried at all. The third tragedy layer was the deepest and the quietest. It was the fear that she had made a mistake so profound, so irreversible, that she would become a cautionary tale instead of a success story. She was 42 years old. She had no children. She had no partner. She had burned every bridge that led back to her old life, and she had not yet built any bridge that led forward. If the sheep died, if the land failed, if the cancer spread, she would have nothing. No home, no money, no one to call. She would be the crazy woman who threw her life away on a fantasy, the punchline of every joke in Mercer County for the next 20 years. This fear lived in her stomach, a constant low-grade nausea that no amount of peppermint tea could soothe. It woke her at 3 in the morning, when the coyotes sang in the hills and the sheep stirred in their sleep. It whispered to her when she looked in the cracked mirror above the barn sink and saw a woman with dirt under her fingernails and lines around her eyes that had not been there 6 months ago. It told her that she was fooling herself, that her courage was actually desperation, that her hope was actually delusion. And the worst part was that she could not argue with it, because every logical person on earth would agree. The numbers did not lie. The bank account did not lie. The empty refrigerator and the overdue electric bill and the phone calls from creditors she no longer answered did not lie. The struggle began in earnest during the 3rd week of October, when the first cold snap came down from Canada and the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight. Margaret had spent every dollar she could spare on hay. But it was not enough. The sheep needed more than grass and grain. They needed shelter from the wind that tore across the open pasture like a knife. The barn had holes in the walls big enough to throw a cat through, and the roof leaked in 17 places that Margaret had counted during the last rainstorm. She spent 3 days hauling plywood and tarps from the salvage yard in town, patching the walls with screws she bought by the pound and insulation she scavenged from a demolished house on Route 68. Her hands blistered and bled. Her back ached in places she did not know could ache. She worked until her vision blurred and her muscles shook, stopping only when the sun went down and she could no longer see to drive a nail. But when the wind howled that first freezing night, and she checked on the sheep with a flashlight and found them huddled together in the corner she had fortified, dry and warm and breathing steady, she cried for the first time since the auction. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief so powerful, they felt like they might crack her ribs open. The first failure came in November, when the veterinarian she had finally scraped together enough money to hire looked at the flock and delivered his verdict with the emotion of a man reading a grocery list. The sheep were not just malnourished. They were infected with a parasite called Haemonchus contortus, commonly known as the barber poleworm, and it was killing them from the inside. 3 of the weakest ewes had already died in the night, their bodies cold and stiff when Margaret found them at dawn. The vet recommended culling the entire flock, burning the pastures, and starting over with clean stock in the spring. He said the treatment would cost more than the sheep were worth, and even then, the survival rate was maybe 30%. Margaret stood in the barn with the bill in her hand. $240 she could not spare. And she looked at Miriam, who was standing apart from the others, her breathing shallow and her gums pale as paper. The vet packed his bag and said he was sorry. Margaret waited until his truck disappeared down the driveway, and then she sat in the straw and held Miriam's head in her lap and made a decision. She would not cull them. She would not give up on them. She would find another way. She would research. She would experiment. She would fight for them the way she wished someone had fought for her. The second failure came 3 weeks later, when Margaret's homemade deworming protocol, a combination of herbal remedies she had researched online and copper sulfate she had mixed herself, proved insufficient. 5 more sheep died. She buried them herself, digging graves in the frozen ground with a pickaxe and a shovel, her shoulders screaming and her heart breaking with each body she lowered into the earth. She marked each grave with a stone she carried from the creek bed, and she said a prayer over each one, not because she was particularly religious, but because she needed to believe that someone was listening. The neighbours watched from the road. Jed Carver drove by slowly, his face unreadable behind the windshield. Margaret knew what they were thinking. She knew they were waiting for the final collapse, for the moment when she admitted defeat and called the renderer. After all, she could feel their anticipation like a physical pressure, a weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. That night, she sat in the barn with the remaining 29 sheep, and she talked to them, not about farming or wool or profit, about fear, about loss, about the way hope can feel like a trap when you have been disappointed too many times. The sheep listened. They chewed their cud and blinked their amber eyes and did not judge her. In their presence, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt seen. The third failure was the hardest because it came from within. In mid-December, with the first snow falling and the bank account down to $1,100, Margaret woke up one morning and could not get out of her sleeping bag. Not because she was physically trapped, but because her mind had finally caught up with her body and demanded to know what she thought she was doing. The questions came like blows. Who are you to think you can save these animals? What makes you believe you are special enough to succeed where everyone else would have quit? You are 42 years old, alone, possibly dying, and you are sleeping in a barn with sheep that the world considers garbage. This is not courage. This is delusion. Margaret lay there for 2 hours, paralyzed by the voice that sounded so much like her ex-husband, so much like her mother, so much like every person who had ever told her to be realistic and settle for less. The sheep stirred around her, their breath fogging in the cold air. Ruth, the oldest and the bravest, walked over and nudged Margaret's face with her wet nose. The touch was so simple, so unexpected, that it broke the spell. Margaret got up. She built the fire. She fed the flock. She kept moving. The turning point happened by accident. And that is how most turning points happen. It was a Tuesday in late January, the kind of day when the sky is the colour of old concrete and the wind finds every gap in your clothing. Margaret had been experimenting with the wool from the sheep that had died, trying to learn how to clean it and card it and spin it into yarn. She had no idea what she was doing. She watched YouTube videos on her phone, sitting in the barn with her breath visible in the air, pausing and rewinding until her battery died. The wool from the first sheep she had processed was lumpy and uneven, full of vegetable matter, and second cuts where her shearing hand had trembled. She threw it in a basket and forgot about it. But on this particular Tuesday, a woman named Patricia Holbrook got lost driving from Louisville to a craft fair in Harrodsburg and took a wrong turn down Margaret's gravel road. Patricia was a fibre artist, a weaver, who sold her work at galleries in 3 states and had been featured in magazines Margaret had never heard of. She saw Margaret in the yard, struggling to carry a bale of hay, and she stopped to ask for directions. Patricia noticed the basket of wool sitting on the porch steps. She picked up a handful without asking, and her trained fingers felt something that made her eyebrows rise. "This is not ordinary wool," she said. Margaret, exhausted and suspicious, asked what she meant. Patricia held up a lock of fleece to the grey light, and Margaret saw it for the first time through someone else's eyes. The crimp was tight and consistent, 3-dimensional, almost sculptural. The luster was unlike anything she had seen in the videos. The staple length was long and strong, with tips that tapered to a fine point. Patricia asked where Margaret had gotten it. Margaret told her the story of the auction. The cull ewes, the barber poleworm, the 29 survivors. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when Margaret finished, she said something that changed everything. "These are not meat sheep, Margaret. These are Cotswolds. Or at least mostly Cotswold, mixed with something else that I cannot identify without testing. Do you know what Cotswold wool sells for?" Margaret shook her head. Patricia named a number that sounded like fantasy. $40 a pound, raw. $120 a pound, washed and carded. $250 a pound, spun into yarn. Margaret's knees went weak. She sat down on the porch steps, and Patricia sat beside her, and together they looked at the 29 sheep in the south pasture, and neither of them was laughing. The accidental discovery was not just the breed. It was the condition. The sheep had been so neglected, so starved, that their bodies had gone into survival mode, diverting every available resource to maintaining the one asset that might protect them from the elements. Their wool had grown denser, finer, more lustrous than it would have under normal circumstances. It was a biological miracle, a response to trauma that had produced something beautiful. Patricia explained that stress could sometimes trigger a protective mechanism in heritage breeds, causing them to produce fibre of exceptional quality. It was rare. It was unpredictable. But it was real. She took samples from 3 of the healthiest ewes and promised to send them to a lab in Vermont for micron testing. She also promised to come back in 2 weeks with a professional shearer and a plan. Margaret watched her drive away, and she walked into the barn and sat in the straw and laughed until she cried. The sheep gathered around her, confused by the noise, and she hugged each one of them and told them they were magnificent. They were not garbage. They were not cull ewes. They were treasures that the world had mistaken for trash, and she was the only one who had been desperate enough, broken enough, to see it, The transformation did not happen overnight. It happened year by year, season by season, with the slow inevitability of a glacier carving a valley. The first year was about survival. Margaret learned to shear with the help of the professional Patricia brought, a quiet man named Thomas who had sheared sheep in New Zealand and Scotland, and said Margaret's flock had the best wool he had handled in a decade. She learned to skirt and wash and card and spin, each step a meditation that required her full attention, and left no room for the dark thoughts that had plagued her before. She sold her first batch of yarn at a farmer's market in Lexington, pricing it low because she did not believe anyone would pay premium prices for wool from a woman they considered a joke. She sold out in 4 hours. People came back the next week asking for more. A boutique in Louisville placed an order. A knitting blogger featured her work. By the end of the first year, Margaret had made enough money to fix the barn roof, install proper fencing, and hire a part-time farmhand, a quiet teenager named Luis, whose family had immigrated from Guatemala and who treated the sheep with a gentleness that made Margaret's heart swell. The second year was about expansion. Margaret bought a small flock of registered Cotswold rams and began a careful breeding program, selecting for the traits that had made her original flock so valuable. She built a shearing shed with a concrete floor and good lighting. She invested in a drum carder and a spinning wheel that cost more than her first car. She learned about natural dyes, experimenting with black walnuts and indigo and madder root, until she could produce colours that looked like they had been harvested from a sunset. The 29 original ewes became the foundation of something much larger. Ruth gave birth to twins, a ewe lamb and a ram lamb, and Margaret stayed up all night in the lambing barn, watching the miracle of new life, with tears streaming down her face. She named the ewe lamb Hope, because that was what she had finally allowed herself to feel. The county still whispered about her, but the whispers had changed. They were no longer laughing. They were watching. They were wondering. The same feed store where men had mocked her now stocked her yarn on a special display near the counter. The same newspaper that had called her a curiosity now ran a front-page story about her innovative approach to heritage breeding. The third year was about recognition. Margaret's wool won a blue ribbon at the Kentucky State Fair. A national fibre magazine ran a 6-page feature on her farm, calling it a model of sustainable heritage breeding. She was invited to speak at conferences, to teach workshops, to consult with other farmers who wanted to replicate her success. She hired 3 full-time employees and built a mill on the property, a small but efficient operation that could process 5,000 pounds of wool a year. The original 47 acres were no longer enough. She leased an additional 200 acres from a neighbouring farmer who had watched her success with a mixture of resentment and respect. Jed Carver came to her door one autumn afternoon, hat in hand, and asked if she would sell him breeding stock for his own flock. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, remembering the laughter, the pictures, the spitting on the concrete. Then she shook his hand and said yes, because she had learned that the best revenge is not punishment. The best revenge is invitation. She sold him 3 ewes at cost, and she offered to mentor his daughter, who wanted to learn spinning. The laughter had stopped completely by then, replaced by something even more satisfying. It had been replaced by respect. The results spoke louder than any words ever could. By the 4th year, Whitmore Heritage Wool was generating $470,000 in annual revenue, with profit margins that made agricultural economists scratch their heads. Margaret had paid off the loan she had taken to build the mill. She had bought back her house in Ohio, not to live in, but to prove to herself that she could. She had established a scholarship fund for young women entering agriculture, named after her grandmother, the woman who had rocked on that porch and believed that her granddaughter could do anything. The flock had grown from 29 survivors to 187 registered animals, each one traceable to the original auction pen where Margaret had placed her impossible bet. The wool fetched prices of $320 a pound at wholesale, with a waiting list of boutique buyers that stretched 18 months into the future. The second number that mattered was the lives changed. Louise, the farmhand she had hired in the first year, was now her operations manager, running a team of 12 people with a confidence that had replaced the shyness of his teenage years. 3 of her employees had started their own fibre businesses, with mentorship and seed funding from Margaret. The scholarship fund had sent 7 young women to agricultural college, with 2 more starting in the fall. The county that had laughed at her now hosted an annual wool festival that drew 10,000 visitors and generated $2 million in local economic impact. The dying auction barn, where she had bought the sheep, had been restored and renamed the Whitmore Market, a place where heritage breeds were valued and small farmers could find buyers who understood the worth of what they raised. Children came on field trips to learn about sustainable agriculture. Elderly weavers came to buy fibre that reminded them of their grandmothers. The place that had been a symbol of failure was now a symbol of possibility. The third number was the one Margaret kept private. It was the number 0. 0 recurrences of the cancer that had been removed in a surgery she had finally been able to afford in the second year, paid for in cash because she no longer needed insurance companies to validate her survival. 0 days since she had last spoken to her mother, who now visited every spring for lambing season and helped name the new babies. 0 regrets. Not because every decision had been perfect, but because every decision had been hers. She had chosen the broken path. She had chosen the hard way. She had chosen to see value where others saw only waste, and that choice had saved her life in more ways than one. The surgery had been successful. The margins were clean. The doctor who had delivered the diagnosis 3 years earlier now sent her patients who needed hope more than medicine, people facing their own impossible choices who needed to hear that survival was possible, even when the odds looked catastrophic. The lesson is not that you should sell your house and buy sheep. The lesson is that the things the world discards are often the things that contain the most hidden value. The lesson is that your lowest moment, your most desperate hour, your most ridiculed decision might be the exact doorway you need to walk through to find the life that was waiting for you all along. Margaret Whitmore did not become successful because she was special. She became successful because she was willing to be the only person in the room who was not laughing. She was willing to look at 37 broken creatures and see possibility instead of punchlines. She was willing to sleep in a barn and dig graves in frozen ground and learn skills that terrified her because she understood something that most people never learn. She understood that dignity is not something the world gives you. It is something you claim for yourself. One impossible choice at a time, until the laughter fades and the only sound left is the sound of your own heart, beating strong and steady and true. So, here is the question I have for you, and I want you to think about it before you scroll away. Where are you watching this story from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments, because I want to know who is hearing this message. I want to know who is out there, maybe in their own moment of desperation, wondering if they have the courage to make the choice that everyone else is laughing at. Because I am here to tell you that you do. You have it. It is in you right now, waiting. And when you find it, when you finally stop listening to the laughter and start listening to your own heart, everything changes. Not overnight, not without struggle, but completely and forever, and in ways you cannot possibly imagine from where you are sitting today. The wool frenzy was never really about wool. It was about one woman who decided that she was worth more than the price the world had placed on her, and who proved it by refusing to look away from the beauty that everyone else had been too blind to see. Be that woman. Be that man. Be that person. Start today.